Of course, you can create figures in Matlab just for the art of it, and it's perfectly fine, but most of the time your graphs will actually be part of some kind of work you're doing, a smaller, bigger project, and those figures will have to be eventually included in a written report about your work. So this short video will show you how to export figures from Matlab and use them externally. So there are two major ways to do it, and the first one is, we could call it manual export. So you find it when you go to menu file and then choose export setup. There's also an option of save as, but export setup is much more user-friendly because you can modify your figure before you actually save it to an external format. And then, of course, the choice of format is quite wide, so you could have JPEG, PNG, EPS, PDF, and more. So let's go straight into an actual example. I will use a figure we've produced with one of previous topics, and this was this three-dimensional graph. So now, once again, Matlab, when it makes a figure, it makes those very specific proportions in here. So however, for instance, your subplots are arranged, their size and look is adjusted to this initial size of the figure. So now, as I said, there is the file and there is option save as, but that's not the one I recommend to use. I recommend to use export setup, because this one will allow you to play with the looks of your figure to the point that you're happy and you feel ready to actually export it. So the properties you can play with, I'll just mention the most important ones which I find the most useful. And of course, as you go on, you can maybe play with some other ones. One is the size. So as you can see in here, there is this default figure size, but we can give it size which is based on real measures. So for instance, if I want all my figures to be keeping the same proportion of the fonts and everything, I will always export a portion of figures for a particular report with the same width, so that I know that when I also fix the fonts, my figures will look kind of consistent between each other, so I wouldn't have report where one figure has huge font, much bigger than the font of the text itself, and then another one would have tiny one, which is much smaller. This really doesn't look good in scientific work, or I would say in any report, unless for some reason the font is really supposed to be much bigger. So for instance, I commonly use width of 15 centimeters. If you think the A4 sheet of paper, the width of the shorter edge is about 21 centimeters, 20-21, and we take 2.5-3 centimeters for a margin on each side, then the width of the text column on such a paper would be about 15 centimeters. So then I know that when I set this width here, and then I fixed the fonts, for instance, to be 10 points or 12 points based on the font in my report, then I will always have nicely same looking graphs. Then the height, you can ask Matlab to rescale it automatically. So auto would mean that if I, for instance, if my initial size shrinks, if the width shrinks, then the height will shrink proportionally to that. But you can also, fix height yourself. If I use this auto, you see my subplots are still kind of rectangular. I would prefer them to look more like proportionally, so that the height of the figure is proportional to the XY axis scales. That's why I would reduce the height, for instance, to just 8 centimeters. So now when I apply it, you see they are much shorter in this Z dimension. Another thing is rendering, and here the main feature you might need to use is setting the colors. RGB is the default, and probably the most common second feature here you would use is grayscale, because sometimes when you produce colored graphics you can have it in the online form, but when you submit a paper to a journal, when they produce a printed version, they ask that that print is actually in grayscale. So here Matlab gives you the opportunity to do the grayscale for you. So when you choose grayscale in here and apply to figure, then your graph gets adjusted to that. Next one are fonts. So the point here is that as you start playing with your figure, and as I keep, for instance, shrinking the size, Matlab automatically also shrinks the fonts to just keep the proportions of the initial figure. For instance, if I restore my figure, I get back this one. So now I can tell Matlab to reduce the size here, but I want it to keep the fonts always to 10 points. So it means that even if I shrink my figure to very small size, the fonts will remain at a specific level. So now they are supposed to be 10. How about we put much smaller? Just for fun, let's put maybe 5 and make this auto. And then the fonts we keep like this. So when I apply this to figure, now you can see the fonts are still relatively big, but the figure is super tiny. Alright, here you can also play with the type of the font, so you can change the name if you like something else. You can change the weight, so if you want your font bold, you can make it italic and so on. So this is the place from where you can also regulate the looks of your figure. These things could be individually also changed in the graph itself. For instance, if you have a title, then for that title you can add extra features for the font you use just for the title. But from the export wizard you can do it for the entire graph at once. Alright, and then there is this feature of lines. In here you can actually kind of access the individual lines in the graph, but normally when you want to change the lines it would be much more common to actually do it just in the graph. So if there is something you'd like to draw differently, you would go back to your code and do that. So for the export, usually you would focus on size and fonts, and optionally maybe the coloring. So once I've played around with the figure and I feel happy about it, about how it looks, I can then export it. So once it looks the way I want, I would choose export in here, and this is where Matlab lets me choose what is the type of the file, what's the extension that I want to use. And the default will always actually be with this extension fig. Now the advantage of that one is that you can save a figure as a Matlab figure, then close your work, and later on open that figure and still be able to edit it. So you could, let me save it as maybe my fig. Okay, now I will close it in here, but then I will find it, and let's see, I can actually do it from Matlab, so I can open, and I should be able, yes, to see that figure here. So you see it has that icon in there, and when I choose to open, it brings out that figure I have saved last time. So it actually still had the settings of the grayscale. And what do I mean that you can actually edit it? For instance, if I have forgotten, let's say this figure took me 10 hours of simulations to produce, so I don't want to run those 10 hours of simulations again just to add labels in my graph. But I can do it actually from here. If I go now to Insert and Title, then it should automatically go to the first graph. After it, if I click on the second figure here and Insert Title, then it allows me to insert another one. And that works the same for the labels. So really, if you have done some very long simulation and then you notice that maybe you've forgotten to label something in your graph, or maybe you made a typo, that could have happened also. You don't have to rerun everything. Just remember to always, especially for figures coming from very long computations, remember to save them also as a fig file, because that will really save a lot of your time. So then we have other options in here for export. For instance, we had those other graphic files. So in here you can actually see the whole selection. And I will say it like this. I know that JPG is very common figure type, but it's really not good for exporting stuff from Matlab. And I will demonstrate to you why. So I'll export one as JPG, and then I'll export another one as PNG, for instance, or bitmap. So then let's try and find those figures. Okay, so I have my figure PNG. Seems like something happened with the JPG. Let's try and do it once again. File, export, setup, export, and JPG. Okay. Yeah, it's there now. So now I will open both and I'll show you why JPG is not okay. So there's PNG. Now it came out with this funny small export. So you see, actually, however I try to stretch it, it's actually small, but let's zoom in. So as we zoom in, well, it's not the best quality, but for the scale we have, it's okay. But now let's open the other one. So I'll open JPG. And this one, zoomed, you can see that it has much more of this funny looking shading around the curves. The PNG, if you compare here, for instance, this 0.2 and 0.2, JPG is much worse. So that's why I suggest, if you cannot use EPS, actually EPS is the best one. If you cannot use EPS, go for PNG or bitmap. One of those is much better than JPG. For LaTeX users, if you're a LaTeX user, you know what I'm talking about. For LaTeX users, I suggest you use EPS and then you have your file converted into PDF as you produce your LaTeX document. This is the best quality you can get. And why you shouldn't actually make it as PDF directly. Let's have an example here. So let me produce this original figure once again, and then I will export it as a PDF and as EPS. Let's maybe make small modifications here still. So once again, I'll show you now. You change the proportions in here In the previous example I had this funny small size. Okay, now let's export that one. And one will be my figure EPS. You see Matlab remembers here the last format you've used. Now I'm using EPS. And then I will export one more as a PDF. Okay, so let's see what happens then. Now I have the EPS in here and the PDF in a minute. So the EPS, you can see, is really nice. It doesn't have any kind of shading. It's super good quality. This is really recommended. And also, even if you use a Word document, for instance, what you can do is still export it to EPS and then convert it to PDF using some software or some online converter. Now, why not PDF? The answer is here, because when you have exported your figure as PDF, what Matlab does is create a PDF document with A4 size in this case, where it puts that figure right in the middle. So now if I actually change the look in here, you see I have one PDF page with this huge thing. So now if you try to include this in some kind of document, you have all this awkward spacing around it. So really, if you can't work with EPS to be inserted in your document, then go with PNG, for instance. It's much better than JPG. But the very best quality you can get is actually EPS converted to PDF. Okay, and then another way of exporting figures is actually using the print command. And in here you can also decide to which format you want to print it, and there are some options you can work with. I rarely use print, so I'll have to go to help myself and check roughly how it looks. So we have print figure or save to specific format. And then let's see, there must be some examples. So yes, for instance, if you want to print a PNG file, you'd say print. Then you would say the name of the file you want to be created, and then if it's a PNG, you use -d PNG. If you want EPS, you use -d EPSC. Once again, here you just give the name, so you see Matlab will then create actually a barplot.eps file, and so on. So there's plenty of options in here, and this works perfectly fine. And you can also, there are some options for changing the size and positioning of it. So you just have to go on and play with it if you wish to try it out yourself. But at least the basic print, file name, and then the type is enough to produce a figure using print option.